Naletti's hand was still wrapped around the stem when it slipped, the wine spreading dark and fast across white linen, and the man across from her didn't flinch, didn't reach for a napkin, didn't do anything a normal date would do. He just watched her hands shake and smiled like the spill had told him something he already knew. Across the restaurant, 3 tables away, Choi Seung-ho set down his own glass without looking at it. He had not planned to notice her. He had a meeting in 20 minutes with men who measured respect in seconds of eye contact, and his attention belonged to them. But some part of him, the part that had spent 3 years memorizing the rhythm of her movements, the particular way she held a pen, the exact half-second pause before she said something she didn't want to say, that part of him had already turned, already locked onto the curve of her shoulders at a table that wasn't his. She was not supposed to be here. She was not supposed to be anywhere tonight except the apartment she went home to every evening at exactly the same time, the predictable, careful life she had built brick by brick for 3 years under his employment. And yet here she was, in a restaurant he came to twice a month, sitting across from a man Seung-ho did not recognize, and that, more than anything, was what made him stand. The man noticed him first. Of course he did. People like that always noticed Seung-ho before Seung-ho wanted to be noticed. It was the suit, the stillness, the way the room seemed to lean half a degree in his direction without anyone deciding to. The man's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes recalibrated, the way a chess player's does when an opponent reaches for a piece they hadn't expected to move yet. Seung-ho. The man said his name like he'd been waiting to use it. Not a greeting, a confirmation. Naletti turned, and for the first time in 3 years, Seung-ho watched her face do something he had never seen it do in his presence. It went pale. Not embarrassed pale, not cotton-ally pale, afraid, the kind of fear that lived in the body before the mind had time to organize it into an excuse. Mr. Choi. She stood too fast, the chair scraping. This isn't. Since when do you date? The question came out flatter than he intended, stripped of whatever he might have meant by it, curiosity, accusation, something else he didn't have a name for. He watched it land on her like a slap. Her jaw tightened. Behind her, the man was already rising, unhurried, reaching for his coat with the calm of someone who had gotten exactly what he came for. It's not what it looks like, Naletti said. I didn't say it looked like anything. Seung-ho. The man was walking now, past their table, close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed Seung-ho's. And as he passed, he leaned in, not enough for anyone else to notice, but close enough that Seung-ho caught 4 words meant only for him. Ask her about Thursday. And then he was gone, weaving through the tables toward the exit with the unbothered pace of a man who had never once in his life worried about being followed. Seung-ho's body wanted to go after him. Every instinct that had kept him alive for 15 years in this business screamed at him to move, to have someone tail that man before he reached the street, to find out his name before the night ended. He did not move. Because Naletti was still standing there, one hand braced against the table, breathing like she'd run somewhere, and the wine was still spreading across the linen in a shape that looked, for one absurd second, like a country on a map. And he realized with a strange, cold clarity that whatever was happening here was bigger than a man he didn't know walking out of a restaurant. Sit down, he said, quietly. Not a request, not quite an order, something in between that he didn't usually allow himself to use with her. She sat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. A waiter approached, saw the spilled wine, the silence, the particular weight of the air around the table, and decided wisely to come back later. Outside the window, Seoul moved on without them, tail lights bleeding red down wet streets 30 floors below. Who was that? Seung-ho said. Nobody, a friend. You don't have friends I haven't met. It wasn't arrogance. It was true, and they both knew it was true, and that was what made the lie land so badly. In 3 years, Naletti had never once needed to construct a story for him. She had never needed to because there had never been anything to hide. Her life had been, as far as he knew, almost aggressively simple. Work, home, the small grocery near her apartment. A sister in a cross she called every Sunday, always at the same time, always for exactly the same 40 minutes. Seung-ho, please. Her voice dropped, and for the first time, he heard something underneath the careful professionalism she'd worn like armor since the day he hired her. Can we not do this here? Do what? I asked a simple question. You asked it like an interrogation. I asked it like a man whose assistant just turned white as a sheet because a stranger said 4 words to her. He kept his voice level, but he leaned forward slightly, enough that she would feel it without anyone else seeing. What's on Thursday, Naletti? She flinched. It was small, a tightening around her eyes, gone almost before it appeared, But he had spent 3 years learning her face the way other men learned ledgers, and he saw it. "Nothing," she said. "It's nothing." "You're lying to me." "I'm not. You've never lied to me." He said it simply, without heat, because it was simply true, and the truth of it seemed to land harder than any accusation could have. 3 years. Every report, every number, every late night when I asked you things I shouldn't have asked anyone, you never once lied to me. And now you are, I can hear it. She looked away from him, out at the city, and for a moment he thought she might actually tell him something. Her mouth opened slightly. Then she pulled the sleeve of her blazer down over her wrist, a small, automatic gesture. The kind a person does without thinking, the kind that means more than the thing it's hiding ever could on its own, and said, "I should go home." "Naledi, please." And there it was again, that fear, raw under the surface now, no longer something she could smooth over. "Please don't make this into something it isn't." He let her go. He didn't know later why he let her go. He had built an empire on the principle that you never let anything go unresolved. That loose threads were how men ended up dead in alleys with their own questions still unanswered in their throats. But something about the way she said please, not as a colleague asking a favor of her employer, but as a person asking another person not to look too closely at something that frightened her, made him sit back down, finish his drink alone, and watch her walk out into the rain without an umbrella. He did not go to his meeting that night. He sent his apologies, citing a complication, and the men who received the message did not ask questions, because men who asked Choi Seung-ho questions about his schedule did not generally remain employed by anyone. He went home instead and did not sleep. His apartment occupied the top 2 floors of a building he owned outright, glass on 3 sides, the kind of view that made visitors stop talking the first time they walked in. He had bought it for exactly that reason, for the silence it imposed on people, the way it reminded them, without him having to say anything, of the distance between where they stood and where he did. Tonight the silence pressed on him differently. He stood at the window with a drink he never touched, watching rain streak sideways across 30 floors of empty air, and found himself replaying the same 4 seconds over and over Naledi's face, the moment she saw him. Not surprise, not the mild embarrassment of being caught on a date by an employer. Fear, immediate, total, the kind that doesn't need a second to compose itself because it has clearly been waiting, coiled for exactly this. He thought about the man's voice. Ask her about Thursday. 4 words delivered like a gift, the way men in his world delivered things they wanted to watch detonate later. Whoever that man was, he hadn't been worried about being recognized. He'd wanted to be remembered. That more than anything, told Seung-ho this wasn't an accident, and it wasn't really about Naledi at all, not in the way that mattered to whoever was behind it. She was a door. Someone was using her to get into a room they couldn't otherwise reach. The question was which room. And the longer he stood there, the more he became aware of a second question underneath the first, one he didn't examine too closely yet. Whether the reason this bothered him so much was the threat to his organization, or the fact that for 3 years he had believed he knew this woman completely, and tonight had proven, in the space of 4 words, that he didn't know her at all. 2 days passed, and on the surface, nothing had changed. Naledi arrived at 7:40, as she always did, with the same quiet efficiency, the same stack of folders organized by urgency rather than alphabet, a system he had once found mildly irritating, and now, watching her work, found himself studying for any sign of fracture. There wasn't one. Her handwriting was the same. Her coffee order was the same. She answered his calls in the same clipped, professional cadence she'd used for 3 years, and if he hadn't been looking, really looking, the way he looked at men across negotiating tables, cataloging every twitch and pause, he might have believed nothing had happened at all. But he was looking. He noticed on the first morning that she was wearing a long-sleeved blouse. It was June. The office ran warm even with the air conditioning fighting against floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the building into a greenhouse by afternoon, and Naledi had always worn short sleeves in summer, had once joked, in a rare unguarded moment 2 years ago, that she ran hot, like everyone from home. He remembered that. He remembered most things she said, though he had never examined why until recently. He noticed, on the second morning, that when his security chief's office door slammed somewhere down the hall, an ordinary, meaningless sound, the kind that happened a dozen times a day in a building full of armed men with bad tempers. Naledi's whole body went rigid for a fraction of a second before she caught herself and returned to the document in her hands as though nothing had happened. He had seen that reaction before in other people, in other contexts. The particular full-body flinch of someone whose nervous system had recently been taught, against their will, that loud sounds meant something was about to happen to them. He had seen it in men who'd survived raids. He had never, in 3 years, seen it in Naledi, and the fact that he was seeing it now told him more clearly than anything else could have that whatever had happened to her, it had happened recently, and it had been bad enough to leave a mark that wouldn't show up in any file. He said nothing about either of these things. He had learned over 15 years that the moment you let someone know you were watching them, they stopped showing you anything true, and right now, the small, involuntary things Naledi's body kept doing without her permission were the only true things he had. On the second afternoon, he asked her to bring him tea, an unremarkable request, one he made perhaps twice a week, and she returned with it exactly as she always did, set it down on the corner of his desk without disrupting his papers, and turned to leave. He watched her hands as she did it, steady, practiced, the same small economical movements she'd made 1,000 times before, and found himself thinking that whatever was happening to her outside this building, she had decided, with what must have taken enormous effort, that none of it would be allowed to follow her in here. That thought bothered him more than anything else had so far. Wait. She paused, half-turned, careful, one hand still resting lightly on the door frame as though she hadn't quite decided whether she was staying or going. He stood, walked around the desk, not toward her exactly, but toward the window beside where she stood, so that for a moment they were both looking out at the city rather than at each other, which made what came next easier for both of them. Below them, the late afternoon traffic moved in its usual slow tangle, the sound of it muffled to nothing by the glass, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, two people standing side by side in a silence that felt, for the first time in days, almost peaceful. "I'm not going to ask you again about the restaurant," he said. "Not today." He felt her exhale, very slightly, beside him, the kind of breath a person lets out when a weight they've been bracing against doesn't fall after all. "But I want you to know," he continued, still watching the skyline, "that whatever it is, whoever that man is, if someone is using something against you, I would want to know. Not because it's my business." He paused because that wasn't quite true, and they both knew it wasn't quite true, but he let it stand anyway, because the alternative was saying something neither of them was ready for. "Because in 3 years, you have never asked me for anything, and I find that I would like the chance to be asked." She didn't answer right away. When she finally turned to look at him, her eyes were wet, not crying, not quite, but close enough that he saw it and pretended for her sake that he hadn't. "Thank you," she said, quiet, genuine, and then, before he could say anything else, before the moment could become something neither of them had decided to let it become, "I should get back to the D1 files." She reached for the door, and as she did, her sleeve, already pushed up slightly from carrying the tray, slid back an inch. He saw it. A shadow along the inside of her wrist, yellow-green at the edges, the unmistakable color of a bruise 3 or 4 days into healing. She saw him see it. And before he could say a single word, she had pulled the sleeve down and was gone, the door closing softly behind her, leaving him alone with 2 cups of tea, one of which had already gone cold. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Choi Seung-ho opened Naledi's personnel file. It told him almost nothing he didn't already know. Her name, her visa history, the address of an apartment he'd helped her secure when she first arrived, the bank account he'd set up himself so her salary would clear without the usual delays foreign workers faced. Clean. Perfect. The file of someone who had spent 3 years being exactly as careful as she needed to be. He read through it twice anyway, slower the second time, looking for the kind of thing that wouldn't show up as a fact, a gap in dates, an address that had been updated without explanation, a reference that checked out a little too smoothly. There was nothing. Whatever Naledi was hiding, she hadn't hidden it in any document with her name on it. He closed the file and called for the footage instead. His head of security, a heavy-set man named Doyle who had never once in 8 years asked Seung-ho why he wanted something, brought it without comment, 3 weeks of building entry and exit logs, cross-referenced with the company car service Naledi used for anything outside walking distance. It took less than an hour to find what Seung-ho was looking for, mostly because he wasn't looking for anything specific. He was looking for anything at all that didn't fit the pattern of a woman who went to work, went home, and called her sister on Sundays. He found it on the second pass. 4 times in the last 3 weeks, Naledi had taken the car service not to her apartment, but to a district on the eastern edge of the city, a place of narrow streets and unmarked buildings that Seung-ho knew, the way he knew the names of certain diseases, without ever needing to have visited. It belonged, in the loose and violent geography of organizations like his, to a family that had spent the better part of a decade trying to find a way into territory that was his. He sat back in his chair and stared at the frozen frame for a long moment, Naledi's car, idling at a corner that meant nothing to anyone except the handful of people in this city who understood exactly what it meant. He watched the footage in full silence after that. Naledi getting out of the car each time at the same nondescript corner, walking the same half-block on foot, out of camera range deliberately, he realized, because she'd chosen the one stretch of that district where the cameras didn't reach, and returning each time within 40 minutes. On the first occasion, she walked normally, almost briskly, the posture of someone running an errand. By the third, something had changed. She walked closer to the buildings, head down, the particular economy of movement of a person trying to take up as little space as possible. On the most recent occasion, the footage caught her at the edge of the frame as she returned to the car, walking faster than usual, one arm wrapped protectively around herself in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He thought about the bruise on her wrist. He thought about the man at the restaurant and the 4 words he'd left behind like a calling card. Ask her about Thursday. He ran the dates against his own calendar without quite meaning to, and found that the most recent visit, the one where she'd come back walking too fast, arm wrapped around herself, had been 3 days ago. The same day she'd started wearing long sleeves. He didn't sleep that night either. He found her the next evening, after most of the building had emptied, sitting alone in the small kitchen on their floor with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, staring at nothing. The overhead lights had switched to their dimmer evening setting, the way they did automatically after 8, and in that softer light she looked smaller than he was used to seeing her, not physically, but in some other way, as though the careful posture she carried through the office all day had finally been allowed to drop the moment she thought no one was watching. He didn't sit across from her. He pulled out the chair beside her instead, close enough that when he spoke, he didn't need to raise his voice above something a stranger might call gentle. For a moment he said nothing at all, and neither did she, and the only sound in the kitchen was the faint hum of the refrigerator, and somewhere below them, the city continuing on as if nothing in this room mattered to it at all. "I know about the district," he said. She went very still. Not the stillness of someone caught off guard, the stillness of someone who has been waiting, for days, for a sentence to begin exactly this way, and has rehearsed 100 different responses without settling on any of them. "I know you've been going there, 4 times in 3 weeks. I know the man from the restaurant is connected to it." He kept his eyes on the cup between her hands, not on her face, because he suspected, correctly, that she would find it easier to talk to someone who wasn't looking directly at her. "And I know," he added more quietly, "that someone there has been hurting you. I saw your wrist." The silence that followed went on long enough that he thought she might simply get up and leave, the way she had 2 nights ago. The cup in her hands had gone cold. He could tell by the way she held it now, no longer cradling it for warmth but simply gripping it, the way a person grips something when their hands need somewhere to be. Outside the kitchen window, the lights of the district he'd just named glittered faintly in the distance, indistinguishable from any other part of the city to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. "If I tell you," she said finally, and her voice was barely above a whisper, "you'll do something. And if you do something, it gets worse. Not for me." She looked up at him then, and the fear in her eyes was different from the fear he'd seen at the restaurant, sharper, more specific. The fear of someone who had spent weeks doing complicated arithmetic in her head and always arriving at the same impossible number. For someone else. "Who?" She didn't answer. Her gaze dropped to the table, to her own hands, to the small chip in the rim of the cup she'd been turning slowly between her fingers, anywhere but his face. "Naledi." He turned to face her fully now, and something in his expression must have changed, because she flinched, not away from him, he realized, but at the shift in him, the sudden visibility of something he usually kept locked away even from himself. 3 years. You've sat across from men who would have killed you for less than what you just told me, and you never so much as raised your voice. Whatever this is, whoever is doing this, I need you to understand that I am not the danger here. "I know that," she said, and for the first time, her voice cracked, the careful composure she'd held for 3 days finally giving way all at once, like a wall that had been quietly failing for longer than anyone could see. That's exactly the problem. He didn't understand what she meant. Not yet. The words sat between them, heavy and unfinished, and he found himself searching her face for the rest of the sentence she hadn't said, the part that would explain why being safe with him was somehow worse than whatever waited for her in that district. But he reached for her anyway, slowly, carefully, the way he might have reached for something fragile he wasn't sure he was allowed to touch, and closed his hand gently around the wrist she'd kept hidden for 3 days. She didn't pull away this time. If anything, she went still in a different way now, the stillness of someone who has been bracing for a blow for so long that the absence of one feels almost as frightening as the blow itself. The sleeve slid back on its own, gravity doing what neither of them would, and Seung-ho looked down at her wrist for the first time in full light and felt something in his chest go cold and very, very still. The yellow-green bruise he'd glimpsed 2 days ago was still there. But layered over it, fresher, darker, was another mark entirely, distinct fingerprints, 4 of them, pressed deep enough into the skin that they hadn't faded at all. New, days old at most. The kind of mark that didn't come from an accident, or from carrying something heavy, or from any of the small explanations people gave when they didn't want to say the true thing out loud. Seung-ho's grip on her wrist didn't tighten in warning. It tightened the way a hand tightens around the hilt of something it's about to use. "Who did this to you?" he said. His voice had changed completely, quiet still, but quiet the way a held breath is quiet, the way a room goes quiet right before something in it breaks. Naletti's eyes filled, and she opened her mouth to answer him, the words visibly forming. Part 2 drops in 2 days. Before then, who do you think hurt her, and what do you think Seung-ho does when he finds out? Drop your guess in the comments. We'll find out together.